color, just like the rest of us.
What do you mean, off color?
You know, wrong. Not right. Flawed.
Wait, I don't see anything wrong with you guys.
In 2019, a 35-year-old British man with a history of drug use named Robert Reed was convicted of harassment and received community service, probation, and a restraining order for his crimes. He subsequently broke the restraining order and later stole a bike. In subsequent fleeing from police, he dived into an icy cold lake to avoid capture. He was not successful. He was found, tased, and arrested. He didn't get along with his probation officer, who seemed to have chagrined with Rob's excuses for his behavior. Rob failed to attend court and quite predictably wound up in prison. In his first night there, he was beaten up by a fellow inmate after a disagreement, which resulted in his hospitalization. When he got out 6 weeks later, he had a paranoid psychotic episode brought on by drugs that resulted in him going back to prison. He was charged with assault against the arresting officers. When he got out the second time, he got a probation officer that better fit him, and through support from his family and an understanding justice system, he has not reoffended. Happily ever after, right? Robert had a rough time and was very unlucky, but if he had respected boundaries, didn't do drugs, committed less crimes, and was more agreeable with those around him, or was even more punctual, then he wouldn't be so scarred for life then right now, huh? Could have saved himself all that trouble. One could argue that it was his own fault that it happened, but that the criminal justice system didn't make it any better. All he needed was empathetic individuals for probation officers and a family that was there for him when he got out of prison. It's really easy to get on the straight and narrow, or so they say. I, for one, would not make such an argument. What I didn't tell you is that Rob is a person with autism. Does that change how you digested what I just told you? Did it make you feel sad or angry about his treatment? Did you feel like that before you learned he was autistic? How come? Well, let me elaborate on some stuff I left out. Back in 2016, Rob tried to reconnect with an old friend that did not share the same sentiment. He was declined contact, but was convinced the ex-friend did want to rekindle the relationship. Over the next year, his attempts would wax and wane with the state of his mental health. At least twice during particularly bad meltdowns, he went to the ex-friend's house to fix the relationship, and the police were called. Rob didn't understand why the police were called, or why they were getting involved in such personal matters in the first place. In his mind, he wasn't committing a crime, he was just trying to be friends again, so they could play music together. When Rob was first sentenced, he didn't understand the punishment, let alone the crime. He had to have an additional explanation about what had happened after his sentencing. He was convinced that there was something else he must have done to warrant his sentencing, which was again at the time a restraining order, community service, and probation. Which for some, myself included, consider fairly light, upsetting as it may be. His sentencing by one of his parents' admissions had sent him into a spiral of, quote, despair, anger, and depression, at times suicidal. Well, that's intense. It shouldn't be a surprise that Rob turned to mind-altering substances to help him. Though the reality was, it seemed to only get him into more trouble. His parent Alex reportedly lost count on the amount of psychotic meltdowns bad enough to call an ambulance, and of course, put Rob at odds with the police. When Rob broke the restraining order during a psychotic break, he sent the ex-friend a one-word text message. Hi. I don't know if you know this, but restraining orders aren't just about the distance you have between you and the person you're supposed to stay away from. Any form of communication is restricted. As innocent as it must have seemed to Rob, I'm sure his ex-friend was terrified, and I'm in no way trivializing that. In fact, just the thought makes me want to never say hi to anyone I've ever made feel unsafe, restraining order or not. When he stole the bike, Rob wasn't even aware that what he was doing was stealing. He was squatting, presumably during another psychotic episode, in a house he believed to be abandoned. He moved the bike from the house to the garage in case he needed to flee. And at this juncture, you might think, well, he must have known he was doing something wrong if he was setting up contingencies. He moved the bike from the house to the garage in case he needed to flee. And you might think, he must have known he was doing something wrong if he was setting up contingencies. And unfortunately, I can't say I know what was going through Rob's head, But after his experiences with victimization and knowing bad things can happen to him even if he doesn't understand why, I'm sure he was cautious on general principle. Not to mention the psychosis. Moving the bike from the house to the garage, even though he ultimately didn't take it off the property, even when he did flee, did count as a crime. Burglary, in fact. I don't think you have to be autistic to be confused about that one. But hey, I don't know what it feels to not be autistic. When Rob fled from officers, he would later say he thought he was in a video game. Oddly relatable. Must have been a wake-up call when he couldn't stay in cold midwinter water anymore and got tased. Did I mention he was being chased by dogs and police choppers? Sensory nightmare. Mental health professionals that worked in the local criminal justice system, in a consistent pattern, didn't get involved because drugs were in the situation. Presumably because mental health issues aren't your fault, but drug abuse problems are? Rob's probation officer, who himself had less than a pristine understanding of autism, implied that Rob's autism diagnosis was an excuse bought for him with his parents' money, since they had gotten it out of pocket. Slight tangent. I don't have an autism diagnosis, because I lack health insurance and can't afford it. When I was shopping around for the diagnostic years ago, it was going to cost about $1,800. Maybe a little more, if memory serves. They offered payment plans, but ultimately I couldn't go through with it because the upfront cost was the same as my rent. Moving on, Rob's probation officer saw Rob as uncooperative and generally been confrontational and disapproving of him. Rob's paranoia and anxiety was probably what led him to missing meetings with his probation officer. Still having a hard time comprehending his wrongdoings, he quite reasonably, in my opinion, thought that he was going to be tricked into admitting some kind of wrongdoing. Sounds like living in a Franz Kafka novel. An ASD, or Autism Spectrum Disorder expert, was not brought onto his case. It being concluded that a private one wouldn't want to stake their reputation on Rob's case for a second diagnosis. It's also meaningful to note that there are only 2 counties in Britain with ASD experts on hand to work with probation officers. Weird. When Rob was eventually in prison for missing court dates, he was put into the general population of his prison. When Rob was eventually imprisoned for missing court dates, he was put in the general population instead of the vulnerable prisoner section. After being concussed by his cellmate, Rob would later mention how surprising it was that no guards came to help. Rob's sentence was shortened by a judge that called on that Rob's issue was mental health problems and not criminality. This seemed to be the first time Rob's mental health was put into consideration in his time within the criminal justice system, even though he'd been sectioned before. That's the British word for institutionalized. On one such mental break, he even drove a car into a lake, which isn't super relevant to my point, but I wanted to mention it given I couldn't really fit it in anywhere else, and it's just that this is definitely a more delicate situation than the criminal justice system could hope to help with. Other than just, removing Rob from society altogether. When Rob had a psychotic episode that landed him in prison again for assault against the arresting officers who were arresting him in the first place because he was psychotic and believed that the people in his house wanted to hurt him, the assault charge was ultimately for him biting at the air. By what his parent Alex said, I believe excessive force was used by the police, as the experience was described as forceful and painful. Have I gone this whole video without saying ACAB? ACAB. The assault charge had, inadvertently, breached his suspended sentencing from the humane judge. Wow. The one buff he had, completely erased. Alex says at this point, Rob was a familiar face to the police, and one officer even broke down crying, knowing Rob needs help psychiatrically, admitting that half her job is dealing with mental health and drug-related problems. Again, not criminality. As far as I know, the second stint in prison was uneventful for Rob, as Alex didn't detail any issues. Rob's second probation officer had much more of an understanding of Rob's autism. She was supportive of Rob, not combative like his first one. Even got an ASD expert on the case. And as of May of this year, the probation officer is even considering shortening Rob's supervision order. Wow, considering. A little understanding can go a long way, huh? With this added context, I really hope that you are more pessimistic about the criminal justice system and not so much blaming Rob himself. If not, I have no idea why you're still watching this video. This story came to me through Twitter from another autistic person. Relayed from Alex, Rob's parent, on a blog called Transform Justice, which is part of a charity seeking to reform the criminal justice system in Britain, and not just for the sake of Aspies. A cause worth fighting for sure. Now, I do agree that there should be more things in place to help those in the criminal justice system who aren't neurotypical. More education about things, more understanding about the overlap with mental health issues and drug use, not divorcing the two issues altogether. More experts in fields relating to mental health issues folks face to help navigate the process, and helping those in the system, not just helping to issue out verdicts. There's no reason that Rob should have been treated this way, and because of it, he'll probably be scarred for his whole life, in many ways that were absolutely avoidable. Something that Alex mentions in his post is something called mens rea, which refers to criminal intent. Mens rea refers to criminal intent. The literal translation from Latin is guilty mind. The plural of mens rea is mentis rea. A mens rea refers to the state of mind statutorically required in order to convict a particular defendant of a particular crime. Establishing the mens rea of an offender is usually necessary to prove guilt in a criminal trial. The prosecution typically must prove beyond reasonable doubt that the defendant committed the offense with a culpable state of mind. Justice Holmes famously illustrated the concept of intent when he said, "Even a dog knows the difference between being tumbled over and being kicked." The mens rea requirement is premised upon the idea that one must possess a guilty state of mind and be aware of his or her misconduct. However, a defendant need not know that their conduct is illegal to be guilty of a crime. Rather, the defendant must be conscious of the facts that make his conduct fit the definition of the offense. Like that, Drizzle? Was that okay? Yeah, it was great. Thank you. It is nice having a headmate that can do voiceovers for you when you don't want to stress out your friends. This establishing of a guilty mind is paramount in getting rulings of, say, insanity. Even temporary insanity, like the dreaded and deplorable trans-panic defense. And although I think that, in Rob's case, his lack of understanding what was happening to him and what he was doing as wrong should reduce culpability, even if he fully realized what he did was wrong, he would still have been treated like shit by our criminal justice system. As an autistic person myself, it's a weird thing to see. Especially because, for the longest time, I passed as a neurotypical person. But the more time went on, and the more we had to participate in society, the harder it got to hide my high-functioning, quote-unquote, autism. In my personal life, I don't always know when I'm fucking up, but that doesn't exactly excuse the behavior. And oftentimes, even neurotypical folks don't always understand that they're doing harm. In fact, lack of empathy from understanding where a person is coming from really contributes to people hurting other people and not knowing that it's a problem. If you don't realize you're ableist, then are you really ableist? Yes. Yes, you are. Oh my god. Alex titled their first post about what happened with their son as, "Is harassment a crime if the harasser has no idea that they're harassing?" And although I think the answer should technically be no, I'm also relieved that the question wasn't, is it even harassment? Because even if someone is hurting you and they don't understand that they're doing anything wrong, they're still doing a thing wrong. I once had a fellow Aspie get mad at me for not revealing my dead name when asked, because I knew his legal name, and by his logic, he should know mine too. We aren't friends anymore, to say the least, and no matter how much it was explained to him, he just didn't get it. I was not the first trans person he had ever met. And it's not fully his fault, but at the same time, I shouldn't be made to deal with that. The altercation is a whole different level of what happened with Rob, obviously, but it illustrates my point a bit in that you can be at some sort of an impasse when certain mental health realities rub up against people's consent and doing harm to others. It's really hard to navigate. More egregious situations like Rob's are only made worse when people with guns and tasers get involved. Personal responsibility is something I've painfully internalized, partially because I've hurt people in the past without knowing it, and I want to be better. I want to not hurt people whether I know it or not, or do my best to do it less. But also partially because with all the things that I am, I don't think I'd be treated even half as well as Rob. So I do my best to never get into a situation where I'd be arrested in the first place. But we do live in a society, which is terrifying to say the least. People have threatened to call the cops on me before, and our mental health definitely had a lot to do with it, each and every time. And when it happened, most of the time, I fully realized the stakes were, if the police come, there's a good chance I'll die. Which is a hell of a motivator. But here's the thing. The Western world, and I'd hazard a guess, most of the world, has very inhumane criminal justice practices. One big reason that folks want to defund the police is because of the use of deadly force, or at the very least excessive force, that the police tend to bring in their wake wherever they go. In situations overwhelmingly having to do with mental health problems, problems that will be better suited for mental health professionals, problems that are only exacerbated by the presence of folks who've historically been positioned as the ultimate good guys, which of course demonizes anyone they hurt as criminals, unworthy of empathy and deserving of any roughing up they get, let alone absurd sentencing practices. A game of wolves and sheep and sheepdogs, and a very simplistic way to view human nature. In the few times in the blog post that criminality was mentioned, I winced a bit, as Rob's parent Alex assumes that there's an inherent difference between what we in society label as criminality and what cannot be helped because of neurodivergence. The truth is, it's way more complicated than that. First off, drug dependence is mental illness. They should not be so segregated in discourse. Also, you can become mentally ill once you're chewed up by the criminal justice system, and how society restricts your access to public services, and generally making you unhireable makes reoffenses common from lack of resources or even lack of adequate housing. If you don't have a place to live, then you're always loitering, then aren't you? I learned in rehab that drug dependence rewires your brain, and I think it's fairly common knowledge that the marginalized in society have a parallel history with drug use and trouble with the law. Many queer folks, for example, struggle with drug abuse. With the overwhelming amount of homelessness and suffering of abuse, it's not hard to see why. Though, because of growing up in the 90s and the view of queer people as flamboyant and happy and effervescent, it was a total surprise to me. At least half of my outpatient rehab group was queer, or at least not white, though I was the only trans person there. And I didn't complete my program, mostly because I was thrown out and became homeless. My roommates at the time illegally evicted me and my then partner, fed up with us because I wasn't working from, being in rehab 6 days a week. I had actually gotten sick leave from my job for my substance abuse, and my partner was still on the lease, though didn't have a job. We missed rent once, and it all went downhill. The roommates threatened to call police if we didn't move out immediately, and had friends of theirs sleep over to testify to said police if any aggressive behavior had occurred that would prove that they felt unsafe and that we should be hauled away. We are black, they were white. We complied, not surprisingly, despite not being evicted by the actual landlords for several months. Although it wasn't just being black that informed our decision to leave. It's not like anxiety, autism, and PTSD weren't a consideration as well. Just being around a cop makes me uneasy. And I was raised by one. And to this day, I get very paranoid by even a joke about having the police called on me, because I'm pretty sure I'm not the last person to say this, and I'm definitely not the first. If you call the police on a person of color or a neurodivergent person, then you might be putting them to death. Huh. Which ironically leads me to believe that Rob and his family are white. Which does not make his treatment any less awful, but I share to think about what might have happened if he was visibly of color. Being an intersectionally marginalized person can make you Being an intersectionally marginalized person can make you very self-aware and hypervigilant. Hypervigilance is when you never untap, when you never let your guard down, even in situations where it's perfectly normal to do so, even when you're alone, even when you're with the ones you love, but especially in public. It's very common in folks with a history of abuse. It's the mind's way of making sure that a bad thing never happens again. But it's often maladaptive, meaning it's a behavior that persists even in situations in which the behavior doesn't protect you, and more than likely hurts those around you. Probably yourself too. However, if you're an intersectionally marginalized person, chances are that the hypervigilance is still necessary to some degree, because overwhelmingly you're made aware of just how little humanity you will receive under the law, or even from someone simply scared of you because of who you are. And the internet means you don't have to take my word for it, even though I'm on the internet, which means you are probably on the internet watching me right now, so you could probably just use me as evidence for the point I'm trying to make. Whatever. If you ask neurodivergent folks who are also racial minorities if and why they fear criminal justice, you'd probably hear something like, yes, because people like me end up dead way too often. And I know that in a grander scheme of things, I might be considered to be beating a dead horse because, well, Black Lives Matter and neurodivergent lives matter, and this isn't new discourse. I don't want these problems to fade into the background though. After this video, no matter how much you care, you still gotta go on with the rest of your week, you know? And that's fine. I think it's important to have reminders of injustices that still take place. The needless amount of pain some folks are made to endure, and not just because of racial profiling, but because of the idea of what makes someone a criminal. Not just because of things like racial profiling or ableism, but the idea of what makes someone a criminal and what criminals are, and how that dehumanizes the most vulnerable among us. It's totally sus. Now, I've mentioned before that the death of George Floyd hit me extremely hard, partially because on paper, I have a fair amount similar to him. A drug dependence fostered from self-medicating what my lack of healthcare cannot provide, and an anxiety disorder. Not just being black. Seeing the footage of his death and the things he said prior to his murder felt like things I might say in a similar situation. It was terrifying to watch. Black bodies are definitely not given much importance in our society outside of profit motives, so being an entertainer or providing slave labor as an inmate, our system doesn't really care. Criminal justice system, not the Fluffbyte system. Coupling the treatment of the neurodivergent with that of the racially marginalized, it's not hard to see why one wouldn't be hypervigilant. I'm terribly afraid to go to jail. It's part of the reason I've had so little problems with the law in the scope of my life, even though I am scared to death of being accosted by police, let alone arrested. Because things that are natural to folks like me are stuff like fidgeting, being nervous, especially around new people, avoidance of eye contact, or the appearance or reality of being under the influence. All those things can make someone decide that I'm up to no good. Because people are taught in our society, especially for law enforcement, that those are admissions of guilt. And just stuff that bad people do. Those things tell them that I am a danger to others. Right. That's scary. When really, I'm just scared. And trying my best to cope. At least most days. It's part of why I don't leave my house. And sometimes fear I never will in any meaningful way. Happy birthday to me. Good night, every night. Take care of yourselves. Hey everybody, this is Dusk. We'd like to thank our wonderful patrons, Vite Customer, and finally, Tinlufu, Joystick, Madame Issy, Apollo, and Josie Beard. This was a video we kind of rushed out. Drizzle really wanted to post something on our birthday. This could have been more well produced, but we decided to save ourselves the trouble of adding B-roll and stuff. Thank you. We have a Patreon if you want to jump on that. If you're new to the channel, we still experiment with content, but we can get quite political, though our bread and butter is analysis of anime and video games. We're trans, we're furry, we're in the ADBL community, and we're black. Lots of cool stuff we are, yes. Happy birthday to us. And we hope you have a good one.